Padre Pio is one of the most beloved of all of our saints. But if you ask people why they love him, what's so attractive about him, probably the biggest answer would be because of the miracles. Even during his lifetime, he was known to get miracles to take place. In fact, if he prayed to God for something, God gave it to him. And his reputation was well known throughout all of Europe even. In fact, there was a... It didn't just go off again. No? Did you just touch it again? It went on, went off. Good. Wouldn't be Italian if we didn't have some things go wrong, right? So, as I was saying, his reputation was worldwide. All throughout Europe, people were sending him letters asking for healings, especially for people. And one was even a young priest in Poland, a man by the name of Father Karol Wojtyła, who wrote him a letter asking him to please pray for a young friend of his, a woman who was very young and dying of cancer. And Padre Pio did pray for her, and she was miraculously healed. And of course, that young priest, Father Karol Wojtyła, eventually ended up as being Pope St. John Paul II, the Pope who canonized Padre Pio. So people know very well that when Padre Pio prayed, things happened. However, I don't think a lot of people realize why the Lord heard his prayers. That was a gift to him in response to something that Padre Pio prayed for early on in his life, and the Lord granted his prayer. And that was, as a young priest, he prayed, Lord, as you took on the sufferings for our sins, as you died on the cross, suffering for my sins, help me to take on the sins of others, the people that I will serve. Let me do penance and take the suffering for the sins that they commit. And the Lord granted him his wish, his prayer, and he suffered. And suffer, indeed, he did, in many different ways throughout his life. First, from when he was newly ordained, he was a Franciscan, entered the convent there, and as soon as he was there, he would get violently ill. And he was violently ill as long as he stayed there. When he went home, he miraculously got better. He'd get better and say, all right, time to return back. As soon as he returned back, he was violently ill again. And he attributed it to the devil, trying to keep him from doing God's work. Well, eventually that ended, and he was able to begin his ministry. And, of course, his reputation spread, especially as a confessor. People felt something about him when they went to confession. It was as if he touched their hearts, and they felt so much closer to the Lord because of him. That also meant that he spent long hours hearing confessions, and people coming from all over, coming to him, for the sacrament of reconciliation. The most famous suffering that he endured was, of course, the stigmata, the wounds of Jesus that he, like his namesake, St. Francis of Assisi, who was the first to have, the Lord gave them to him, the wounds in his hands, in his feet, and in his side. And the pains of that he suffered were most acute on Good Friday. And, of course, this was modern times where there's modern medicine and photography and all that, and it was very well documented, and all sorts of different doctors came in trying to poke and prod and figure out what was causing all this, and imagine the embarrassment to him, having people coming up with all these different diagnoses, some people claiming he inflicted them upon himself, others saying it was psychosomatic, some people even having more bizarre explanations for it. And that must not have been very comforting for him, to people think that this man who had the wounds of Christ, because he wanted to be so much like Christ, was a quack. So he had to deal with that. He also had the problem, just like anybody who's famous today, and they have their little groupies and their fans that follow them, and they have to sometimes have bodyguards to keep their fans away, and the paparazzi and all the rest. Well, he had the same thing. He had this little group of old ladies that he called the little rats. Because as he would go through them, whenever he was walking out to go hear confessions or on Mass, they actually would reach out and try to pull pieces of his habit off just so that they could bring home a relic, a piece of his clothing. I mean, the man is wearing the clothing, and they're trying to rip it off on him. So when he had to go through them, he would make a whip out of his cincture, and as he'd go, he'd say, "Get away from me, you little rats! Get away from me!" And that's what he had to do for these people who just were seeing him, more than just somebody who prayed for them, but almost like somehow if they had a piece of his garment, all of a sudden they had a piece of magic with them. And then probably what was the most painful thing of all for him to suffer was from the local archbishop. As his fame spread, the local archbishop was convinced that he was a fraud. He did not believe that Padre Pio had any connection with God. It was all a hoax or anything like that. And he had connections with the Vatican, and he got Pius XI to silence him for several years. He was put under absolute house restriction. He was forbidden to celebrate Mass in public or hear confessions, the thing he did well. He had to do his Mass privately and not come out into the public. And there were so many people looking for him. And I wonder what he thought through all of that. That here he was, somebody doing great work who was silenced by his own bishop there in the area. Thankfully, when Pius XII came along, he knew of Padre Pio and believed in him, and it was lifted, and then Padre Pio could continue the work he did for the rest of his life. But he gave himself as a total offering to God for the sins of people, just the way Jesus did. As he gave himself as a total and complete oblation to the Father by dying on the cross for us, Padre Pio asked to do the same, and he did. And he suffered tremendously throughout his life. The physical pains, the emotional pains, everything else that would go along with it. And he suffered it willingly because this is what he asked God to do. And I think of the readings today that we have talking about anger, how people, the first reading we hear that vengeance and anger are hateful things and the sinner holds them tight. And he didn't hold to the anger at people who thought he was a fraud, even the archbishop there, but rather he submitted it to the Lord. I'm sure he forgave him in his heart for his misunderstanding of what he did. He didn't hold anger close, he held Christ close, and Christ's cross. And the suffering that he endured each and every day, he did gladly because of his love for the Lord, so that he could do for people what Jesus did for us. And imagine if we could learn from that. If we could ask the Lord to help us to serve others the way he served us. Maybe even, perhaps to the point of even saying we have somebody, Lord, in our family, maybe who is not worshiping, who is living a sinful life, whatever it may be, and we say, Lord, bring them back. Would we be willing to take on some suffering to bring them back? That's a tall order. Okay, that would show truly the saintliness of people. I don't know how many people would be willing to do that. But that's what Padre Pio did. Maybe we can pray about that and ask the Lord to help us to suffer for others and their sins as Jesus did for us. Indeed, in doing that, there will be some people that would scoff at us, would look at us and think we're crazy and say, why are you worried about them? You worry about your own soul. Well, we have concern about other people's souls. We are responsible for them. As Cain said to the Lord, am I my brother's keeper? The answer that comes back in that almost sarcastically is, yes, you are. And we do have an obligation to pray about, to care about people around us who have fallen away from the Lord, and to pray for them. Maybe even if we'd be willing to suffer for them and say, Lord, bring their sufferings upon me. I will pay them as long as they come back. I think any of you who are parents could relate to that very easily. If you saw your child suffering, would you not in a heartbeat say to the Lord, Lord, let me take my child's suffering. Bring it on me, but spare him, spare her. I think most parents would do that instinctively for their children. Well, if we could have that same love, not just for children, but for everyone else, and say, Lord, help me to desire the salvation of souls that are lost to you, even to the point of my suffering for them. If we can do that, then indeed we have learned the love that Padre Pio had for the Lord, the love that Jesus had for us by taking our sins upon ourselves. And so today, as we reflect upon Padre Pio, when we celebrate having a feast day, remembering the beautiful gift of this saint, may we remember not just that God works miracles through him during his life and even now in death, that many people who pray to him do find miracles granted, but may we all the more importantly remember what was behind it, his desire to suffer for souls the way Jesus suffered for us. And may we always allow the example of Padre Pio to lead us closer to Christ and to embrace him tight and his cross, as Padre Pio did every day of his life. May Jesus Christ be praised, now and forever.